Hello, Ravens. I hope you are enjoying your summer. I certainly miss all of you, and I'm excited to get to see you again in September. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll see. But in the meantime, I wanted to give you a bit of an update on an exciting project that I've been working on. I've talked about in a lot of my classes the Marble Machine X project, which, if you don't know, is this incredible music playing marble machine that Martin from the band Wintergatan has been working on for the past 2 years. It is this absolute masterpiece kind of in the making. It's been an incredible journey watching. If this interests you at all, I really encourage you. You've got plenty of time on your hands. They're at video, I don't know, 135 or something like that. So it's been 2 years of following Martin's journey in creating this machine. Really interesting and exciting design and engineering and art and the intersection of all those things. So highly recommend. But where I come into this is really exciting for me. So one of the things that I've always loved about the Marble Machine X project is that Martin has been using Fusion 360 for the CAD work to 3D print stuff and mostly to do a lot of CNC machining and just the overall design and planning as well. And so it's been really interesting watching him learn about Fusion 360 and seeing how that applies to what you folks learn in my classes about Fusion 360. The thing is, over time, as this machine got designed and developed, as you can see, there are just an incredible number of parts on here. If you were to count up all of the hardware, just like nuts and bolts and screws and things, we're talking in the thousands. And when you try to model all of that in one assembly in Fusion, it can get quite clunky, sluggish, right? So really hard to load. Navigating around, if you're not on an incredibly high-end computer, would be pretty choppy, pretty laggy. And just hard to work with in general. Another issue that came up for Martin was that over time, if he'd be making fixes on the machine or improvising some parts just by hand, the physical machine over time became a little bit divergent from what was modeled in CAD. And, when you're starting to look at cable management and finding clearances for different parts, it's really important that the CAD model, as accurately as possible, reflects the actual model. As well, Martin's wanted to make the CAD model available for other users and artists to make interesting things out of having that model, but the excessively complicated and clunky, all fasteners included CAD model doesn't really work well for that if you're thinking about sharing it with other people for them to use in other applications. So what Martin did a few weeks ago was reach out to the community and ask if anyone would be interested in getting involved with kind of overhauling the CAD model. And so was formed the community CAD team that I'm a part of. We're about 150 or so. I'm not sure the exact number. CAD users from around the world who are pitching in our time to, for now, redo the CAD model of the Marble Machine X. And we're actually going to do this in a few phases. So a few models will come out of this. The very first model that we're working on, the first phase, or maybe even phase 0, is what's called a defeatured model. So what we're doing is taking every single part and simplifying it to just the geometry that matters in terms of its location and clearances, but removing anything that slows down load times or makes any of that, moving the camera around or working with the file choppy. So taking out every fastener, most holes for the fasteners, no modeled threads. If there's multiple bodies that are the same material and they're rigidly connected together, we're just making that a single part, just to really ease up on the computational requirements of this. Along the way, this is also going to help track down all of the parts, all of the various CAD models, wherever they happen to exist, and kind of pull that all together as we're simplifying it, so that when we move on to the next stage, which would be to make a fully manufacturable version of this with all of the threaded holes and every fastener accounted for, we have at least a good place to start. So that's step one, and it's a massive undertaking. It's going to take a lot of hours and a lot of people to do, and it's just about one step at a time. So I actually got a part assigned to me a couple weeks ago. It is this part here, which is these tracks as the marbles come out. So they hit the vibraphone, they go into this funnel, they go through a tube, and then they come out here, and then they roll together and end up merging with all the other marbles from various parts of the machine back into the loop that takes them up to the top. So this part, as well as this bracket, was my assignment. I actually had the original models from Martin, so it was just kind of tidying that up. And then in terms of modeling it on the actual machine, this is a piece of plywood, but it's kind of warped and bent. So just kind of had to do a quick and dirty bend to this whole thing to make sure that it lined up with the other parts. Not too hard. I'm not going to show you that, because as soon as I submitted it, basically the next day, Martin uploaded this video that I have open here. And it's basically just, hey, I'm chopping off this piece and here's the replacement. So my task continues. And so this is the new part, the new version. Very beautiful. Like, look at these marbles rolling. And they kind of speed up as they go in. Very interesting part. So I have to remodel this. Luckily, I get to keep this bracket, but I'll still show you how that came together. Then we've got these parts here, which is actually fairly straightforward because I have the original files from Martin. There's another bracket under here that I have to model. That's a big chunk of the work, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. And then the last thing that I won't get to today, but maybe in a future video, is this piece here where those tracks come together. And this is not modeled in CAD anywhere. Martin cut this just freehand with everything in place to make it fit. So I'm going to have to approximate this as best I can based on this screenshot basically and the other geometry that I have. But I'll save that for a future video, or I'll just show it to you later. Now, I have a strong suspicion that I'm going to have to redo this again. No shade to Martin, but and I've seen other people talk about this problem. So these are very thin pieces of plywood. And if you watch the video, Martin takes a lot of care to bend them and secure them in just the right way so that he gets this exact kind of motion that he's wanting, where they kind of come out slow and then they speed up as they come around the corner. Now, as this goes on the road on a world tour, these bits of plywood are going to warp and bend with humidity changes. And so that's going to throw all of that fine calibration out the window. My expectation is that I'm going to be redoing this part at some point, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. And for now, let's have some fun. I thought it would be an interesting thing for those of you that are learning Fusion 360 to see how I approach this challenge here. So to kick things off, we'll just hop over into Fusion here. This is actually the file from Martin that I got. So you can see here are those curved pieces of plywood. And then what he did, he modeled these in 3D with these curves to fit the actual assembly, and then took the top plane of these and made that into a 2D shape so that they could be cut out on the CNC out of plywood. So really all I care about are these things, which it looks like, okay, so they're a separate component. So I think what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to export this component. I'll save a copy as. I'll just call this VibeTracks redo. And now I've opened that up. So one thing that we've talked about a lot in Fusion 360 is this idea of rule 1 of creating empty assemblies or empty components and building each individual part as its own component. For this de-featured version of the Marble Machine X, part of the CAD guidelines, the standards that our team has put together, is kind of the opposite of that. Anything that is its own part, so in this case, these tracks along with that bracket that they attach to and the thing that collects them all, that's just going to be a single component made up of just bodies. So these bodies aren't going to be individual components. So this is a fine place to start, given that I just have these bodies. So that's great. So one thing that we're also doing is trying as best we can to have every part use the same origin. So here is the current version of the base assembly that my marble tracks are a part of. And so they're going to attach right in here. So the thing I'm going to do is I'm going to insert this in, try and just kind of roughly line it up and see what's going to need to happen. I'm just placing this really roughly just to kind of get a sense. So when I start the next part of this, I know that this is like at least kind of in the right spot. So when I move this here, we can see the origin for this part, that's this one, is way over here. And what I would like is for this origin to be down here. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this whole component. We'll do a point to point, and we'll move that origin down to there. Now, the other thing is that the origin of this is rotated from the origin of this base model. So I should actually rotate this whole component over this axis 90 degrees to get that in line. So that's if the origins are lined up and now the part is not lined up. So what I'm going to need to do is edit this part so that it is in a different place relative to its own origin. So I could go back and do that in here, but I wouldn't know where to move it. What I can do in here is I can say edit in place, and we'll capture that position. And now I can move bodies. I want to move all of them, and we'll just do free move here. We're just kind of roughly getting it into place. So now I'm moving this relative to its own origin. This is so that when other people are loading these models into an assembly, they are already going to show up in the right place. And they don't need to track down like exactly how they align. So then what I can do is I could check this, finish to edit in place, save this, okay. And once that's done saving, I'm going to flip back to the other file. And we can see that it's got an out of date warning. So I'm actually just going to close it and open it up again. So now we can see the origin is down there. We've got our part here. And the next step is going to be working on that bracket. And I'm just going to flip to the video and show you exactly what I'm talking about here. And it's this piece here that is going to take a little bit of work to model, and I'm going to have to make some assumptions, but I'm also going to base some things off of measurements from the actual model as it exists now. I don't think any of the assumptions I'm going to be making are really critical measurements. If I needed to, I could submit a request to Martin to take a measurement off the machine, but I don't think that's important. Unfortunately, I don't have the CAD model for this, which is odd. So, I mean, it's possible he just did this by hand on his CNC, just because it's just a repetitive geometry. We're not sure. I'm not sure. But what we can do is model this to the best of our ability. So this piece here fits onto the assembly here on this metal bracket. So it's the underside, and then there's a top bracket that I already have from the last time, a top half of this. And so those two together kind of sandwich the track pieces. So you can see there's that part there. So we've got these 11 rails for the marbles as they come out. Although I don't even know if they contact these because the curved rails are above them. These notches in the back are to clear these, and then there's some kind of posts here just to help with spacing, because some of the tracks are thin on the end and some are thick. And so here, where we've got two thin ones side by side, there needs to be a spacer. And so that's that piece. The way that I start with something like this is just on pen and paper. And here's just my rough sketch of kind of just some of the basic geometry, just starting to map out some of these numbers that I can know. So where do I find these numbers? So some of these things came from this other model. For example, the spacing between each of these I know to be 34 mils. Okay, that's right here. Another thing I could figure out was the height of this part, because the other part of the bracket I already had modeled, and I know the total height of that metal bracket. So that's pretty straightforward. Then some things I could figure out based on the parts that I did have are, for example, this width here, all of the short ones are 7 mil, and all of the long ones are 19.8 mil. So that tells me that this is 7 mil, and this, I actually just rounded this up to 20. Again, these aren't critical dimensions. Here, this cutout here, this depth is based on, again, what we know about this part here. So the other bracket comes to about here. So we could measure how much further down we needed to get to clear this. And then in looking at the actual part, I think he went a little bit lower just to make sure there was good clearance. So I just kind of ended up eyeballing that. But this is a place to start, just rough sketch and starting to flesh out some dimensions. And then other dimensions got added to this sketch as we went, as just kind of note keeping. But another really important thing I needed to know was, where does this bracket live in relation to the origin on the model? And that again came from this version of the model. I can simply measure from, for example, this plane to this plane, and that tells me 70 mils. So that means that's where the part needs to start, is 70 mils off of that plane, and I could do that for the other two planes. So in my sketch, that's this. I just know that it's 70 mils this way, 40 mils this way, and 901 mils up. That's the starting point. So we can go in and start making that happen in here. It is back from the origin by 40 mils off of this axis. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new plane to work from that is negative 40 mils back here. And this is where the sketch is going to go. Now I'm just going to rough in this rectangle here. It's kind of here, but exactly where we will define with dimensions. Okay, so let's do that. Dimension this wall to this plane, which is sometimes a little tricky for Fusion to know that I want to select. There. Okay, that's that 70 mils that we just measured. And this bottom to here is that 901 mils. And for now, I'm going to just turn off these bodies so that they're out of the way. Another rule we have in the CAD guidelines is that all of our sketches need to be fully constrained. That means everything is black, no blue lines. A blue line means that something is not constrained. Something still has some freedom of motion. So clearly I'm missing the width and the height of this rectangle, which I do know this to be 17.75, this to be 390. So there's our rectangle. That's the outer shape of this part. So now let's start making this geometry here. So I'll just pull up my sketch again. So some things I'm going to need to do. We have this rectangle cut out here. We actually don't know this width, but it will be kind of just dictated by other parts of this geometry. We know that there's a 7 mil gap, and then we have this kind of rail that rises up and then comes down. Exactly how wide that is, I think we can calculate. We'll figure that out in a second. There's this arc in here. We don't know the radius. We don't know how deep into it is. We're just going to kind of eyeball it, I think. And then there is this other notch cut out for the clearance. And we do know how deep it needs to be at minimum, but we'll eyeball that. And we can also figure out how wide it needs to be, again, at minimum. And then this feature is just copied 11 times down the way. So we don't need to model that every time. We'll use the rectangular pattern tool right within the sketch. Another best practice that we have is trying to do everything as much as we can in a single sketch, just to minimize the number of timeline features that need to be loaded in. So we're going to put all of this geometry in a single sketch and then do all of our extrudes off of that one sketch. So let's get started here. First thing I know is that there is a rectangle that kind of goes the whole way. And we don't know the width of that yet, but that's okay. Then we have a rectangle up. It's got an arc in it. We'll deal with that in a sec. We also have a rectangle down. Now these two rectangles are supposed to be stacked on each other. I think probably the easiest thing to do for this is place a construction line, I think is what I'm going to do here. Because I'm going to need this center for a few other things as well. And then what we can say is that the midpoint of this needs to be on that line. Now, if I move this, so I can move this whole thing around, that's fine so far. And then I can play around with these things. So what do I know? back from here, I know that this gap here needs to be 7 mil to fit the 7 mil track. I also know this depth here is going to be 8.75. That is certainly not right. Oh, it might be right. we haven't gotten this depth down yet. What does this depth need to be? Well, actually, we know that the tracks themselves are 7 mil thick as well as 7 mil wide on the short ones. So we can dimension from this top line to this bottom 7. I suspect it's not that deep though. Yeah, I think my drawing has this from the wrong spot. That's 8.75 from the top here. I think it's certainly deeper than that, but we'll fine tune that later. And in fact, because we're not 100% certain about this measurement, and we're probably gonna wanna change it later, I'm actually gonna make this a parameter. So if you haven't seen parameters yet, this is one of the most useful things to know. It's basically a way to set a variable or assign a number to a name, and then you can use that name anywhere as a dimension, and then you can just go change that parameter here in this menu, and that change will propagate through everything else that is using that parameter as a dimension. You'll see what I mean in a sec. We will call this, what is this? This is like the clearance height, and we'll call it, I'm just going to call it 9 for now because I think it's probably closer to 9. So here in this dimension, instead of putting in the number 9, I can put in clearance height, and that will just set it to 9. What else can we figure out? So we know that the spacing between each of these rails is 34 mils. So that's 34 between the centers of them. It's also 34 between the edge, like this left edge and this left edge. So if we know that from here to here is 34, and we know there has to be a 20 mil gap in between for the rail to fit, that leaves 14 mil left over for this block here. So we know that from here to here, 14 mil. What we don't know is the height of this. So we'll make another parameter here, and we'll call this rail height. To start off with, I think like 1.5 mils, like it's pretty small. Okay, it's still not fully defined, obviously, because this can move around so much. How we're going to figure that out is probably by measuring on here the distance from this plane to the middle of this hole. And we get the minimum, the max, and just the distance to the middle, which is 25. That's the one we're after. We can see it if I highlight it here. So that tells us that from this edge to the center of this geometry, which we have that handy construction line, that's 25 mil. So we can go put that in the sketch as well. From here to this line, 25. So now all that geometry is nice and locked in, which is excellent. We just need this arc as well. Something I suspect is that it's the same radius as the tube, the pipe that comes in. So inside this metal bracket, there's actually a plastic tube, and the inner diameter of that tube, 18 mil. So I suspect that the little rail actually kind of sits right here and has that 18 mil. So I'm just going to go ahead and use that and not worry too much if I'm 100% correct. So we'll actually just move this down manually, and we'll worry about locking it in later. For now, I'm actually just going to lock it in place. So now we have that. We could do the extrudes and then use the rectangular pattern tool to make a rectangular pattern of extrudes, but it is easier on the computer, on the processor, to just copy this geometry over in the sketch and then do a single extrude for all of them. So let's do that. We will create a rectangular pattern and select all the geometry that we want to copy over 11 times. I'm just going to get the stuff that we actually care about. I don't need this bottom line here. We're going this way. We want to make 11 of them. We know the spacing, and that spacing is 34 mil. Boom. And so there we go. We have that all the way to the end. And very last thing is this final wall here. It doesn't know where it's supposed to be, but we know that it needs to be 7 mil from that. Done. Now, a couple things I'm thinking about here as I'm going. This is not the correct number. I remember now. It's actually quite a bit less. It's actually 20.5. I think that was a miswriting there. And you see as I do that, because these other parts are based on that, I'll undo and redo it. And you can see they all update, which is a great reason to use rectangular pattern. A few other things we need to add in the actual part itself. We can see if we look really closely, there is a fillet to these corners as well as these inside corners here to round it out. So the outside corner fillets, I am just assuming are the same as the metal bracket in the assembly that we're basing on, which is 2 mil. These inner ones, we're just going to kind of eyeball. And again, it's not a critical dimension, so we're not going to worry too much about it. So we will add a fillet here, and it's also over here. And that is a 2 mil fillet. And we will also add a fillet here and here. And we will make that perhaps a 1 mil fillet. Now we can see something has gone up with our stuff. And I think that is because when I added those fillets, it broke the rectangular pattern. So I just undid and put the fillet in before making the pattern, and now everything is nice, and all we have to do still is constrain this to here, 7 mil. Boom. So there's that sketch done. So let's go ahead and extrude so we can finish the sketch. Notice how nice and clean our timeline is so far. Let's turn back on our bodies just so we have a sense of what we're doing here. So we need to come out this way. And how far are we coming out? This thickness, this is 18 mil plywood. So we're going to come out 18 mil, and then we'll do this cut separately. So we're going to go ahead and extrude all of this geometry here and here. 18. It's not visible because I've turned the bodies off. And so there it is. And then last thing we need to do for this piece of it is turn back on that sketch. We need to cut out this clearance in the back. Let's just take a look at that here. So that's cutting into both this rail and just the main body as well. One thing I'm just noticing now, I'm remembering I've forgotten about these rectangles. So we'll grab those in a sec. First, let's just do this quick extrude here. Okay, we gotta go back 4 mils as a cut. Boom. I know that's 4 mils just from the other part. This sticks out 4 mils. Okay, so let's go in and add those spacers. And the best way to do this, again, we're not gonna make a new sketch. We'll just edit our old sketch, get rid of these bodies. Actually, we'll use the bodies here to tell us where the spacer goes, here and here. Okay, so it's a rectangle. It's gonna be the same height as these rail. We don't exactly know the width, but we do know that from here to here has to fit one of those rails, and same thing on this side. 7. And we could rectangular pattern if we wanted to be really fancy, but that seems silly. Okay, finish that sketch. Go back to this original extrude and just include these rectangles in. Boom, boom, okay. Look at that, timeline's still clean, and it's all there. Let's hide that sketch. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Next step, let's just get these other bodies and move them up to where they're actually supposed to be. So we'll go ahead and select all of these, and we're just gonna scooch it up. I'm just gonna move it up first just to kind of see where it is, and then I'm going to use point to point to just put it right in place. And then you'll see some limitations of this. I have to hide this so I can grab this point and just scooch it right into here. Boom. Okay. Now some issues with this model. Obviously there's some like weirdness just because of the way that Martin modeled these, but these are plywood pieces, so they're, you know, pliable. And so we're not really concerned that, like, you know, this piece is kind of clipping here. It's not going to be a big deal, but at least we know that they're in roughly the right location. So then we know that the ends are in basically the right location. The last thing I'd need to do is add this upper block that goes up on top that kind of sandwiches them in. I have it modeled from previously. However, I want to keep this, again, to just be a bunch of bodies inside of a component. And if I import this in, it's going to be a separate component. So the kind of hacky way of doing this is going to be to go into this file. This is the sketch that defines it. And I'm just going to copy all of that, go back into here, back into my original sketch, paste. Where did it go? It's down here. Bring it up. I can point to point this to here. We can see it's still blue. That's just because it hasn't been constrained. I'm just going to, like, tell it you are locked into there. Boom. Okay. Okay, it's a little awkward that our circles are, like, not even. This circle, again, was just kind of arbitrarily placed to get that little arc there. And we could change that if we needed to. But let's finish this sketch. We'll have to do this as a separate extrude. And we need to bring out this and this all the way, 18. It's going to think we're trying to cut because it's going to sense that it sees those. We actually just want a new body. And I'm just noticing that I forgot to bring out these. Oh, did I get myself into trouble by having these circles? Four mils in. It knows to do the cut. There we go. Turn off the sketch so it's not so ugly. And there we have what it looks like on the back side. One thing we'll notice here, ooh, look at that. See, that's that outer rim of that pipe. And so that's here where this clearance is coming in. So that's good that it does, in fact, clear that. You might be thinking, ooh, this looks bad that it's kind of clipping into here. But remember, inside of that pipe is that tube, the PMMA tube, that is a little bit tighter diameter. So it actually, these edges don't clip. And if they do, I'm sure Martin sands it down. So whatever. Okay, so we can save this. And just to double check everything, we'll hop back into here. We can see that it is not up to date. So we will click Get It Up to Date, please. And all those changes propagated in, perfect. And there is our part so far. 1, 2, 3 bodies, and then these all swirl around. So still to do, I obviously need to make that back section. That's going to be a real pain in the butt, but we'll make it happen. As well, there are these little kind of clippy things under here that you can see in the video as Martin starts assembling this. He attaches this kind of guide clip to keep the spacing correct between them. So I'll have to model that. The model that I have is not this actual part, so I'll probably base it off of that and go from there. It also doesn't perfectly fit these parts anyways, so we'll see what we can come up with. Shouldn't be too hard. But so long for now. Keep an eye out. Maybe you'll see some of this work in a future Wintergatan Wednesday video. Definitely subscribe to Wintergatan on YouTube. Follow that project. It's super exciting. And again, can't wait to see you all again in September. Fingers crossed. I hope. But otherwise, have a great summer. Bye.